of the best presents I've ever gotten was that recently my wife bought me a pair of ice fishing gloves. And they're the type where you have one finger that can pop up and help you to manipulate whatever you need to manipulate. And in my case, she bought it for me because we daven outside because of the pandemic that we are in. May Hashem bring it to an end speedily. And so therefore, the gloves allow excellent protection because sometimes we're davening and the temperature's in the 20 degrees, and so our hands could get very cold, but we want to be able to manipulate the pages. And so therefore, even though we're praying outside 3 times a day to maximize safety, the gloves that my wife bought me as a gift, they are keeping my hands very warm and very comfortable. So that's one of the best presents that I've gotten. But then this past week, as part of our Daf Yomi studies, we came across a text which is cited in connection with a halacha from the Shulchan Aruch, where the Shulchan Aruch and in the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Tzadi Aleph, Sivka and Yud Beis talks about the fact that one is not supposed to wear gloves, no gloves during prayers. The Mishnah Berurah really, quoting the Bach, quoting an earlier source, explicitly states one should not wear gloves while praying. And I was thinking, I mean, we need our gloves. Otherwise, it's freezing. How are we going to be able to daven in these difficult times without gloves? So luckily, when I looked into the matter, the poskim do allow for an allowance for protection from the cold, as they argue that the gloves during prayers are only problematic if they're reflecting an inappropriate mindset for prayer. Like a person should not wear boots in a shul while they're praying, because their boots demonstrate you wouldn't wear boots in your house. So typically speaking, you wouldn't wear gloves in your house. So if it's disrespectful in that manner, then a person shouldn't wear the gloves while they're praying. But if a person is wearing the gloves because they're praying outside in a pandemic and it's cold, so that in that context, in the context of the freezing conditions that we're praying in, it's going to be certainly permitted. The reason why this relates to our Daf Yomi studies is because some say that the source for this practice, this prohibition of saying that you're not allowed to wear gloves when praying, traces back to a Gemara in Pesachim, where we learned in the Gemara in Pesachim of 57a and b, Nun Zayin Amud Aleph and Amud Beis, that the Gemara tells a story of a Kohen Gadol, Yisachar, the Yisachar of Kfar Barkai. And this Yisachar of Kfar Barkai, he was a person who was responsible to do the avodah, to do the service in the temple, but he didn't want to get his hands dirty. He didn't want his hands to be touching the sacrifices and whatever he was dealing with, either the blood or the flour or any of the services that the Kohen Gadol does. He didn't want his hands to get dirty, so he used to wrap his hands in silk to prevent them from getting dirty. And in gloves, he basically wore gloves. And the people of the courtyard of the temple, they called out to him. They said, "Get out of here!" They threw him out. They said, "We don't like the fact that you're not wearing gloves. Not wearing gloves wearing gloves when you're doing the service in the temple is problematic because it's a chatzit. So it's an interposition between your hands and the avodah, which is problematic." Rashi says, but also it was a sign of arrogance that he thought that he was more important than the avodah. His concern for his hands was more important. He didn't want his hands to touch the aspects of the service, and therefore it was a sign of arrogance, and that's why the people threw him out. So the Gemara says, what was his punishment? His punishment was as follows: that what happened was that there was a king and queen who were having an argument, a frivolous argument, so to speak. They were arguing which is better, a sheep or a goat, which meat tastes better. So the queen said that the sheep tastes better than the goat, and the king said that the goat tastes better than the sheep. So they brought forward, he said, who are we going to ask this question to? Who knows about this stuff? Let's ask the Kohen Gadol. So they brought forward Yisachar of Kfar Barkai, and they said to him, which is better, a sheep or a goat? And he waved his hand dismissively to the king and queen, like, you're bothering me, I'm the Kohen Gadol, and you're bothering me. So he waved his hand. And then he said, obviously a sheep is better because we bring the sheep every day for a Karban Tamid. And when we bring the daily offering, morning and afternoon, it's Keves Echad. Bring a sheep. So obviously the sheep is better. And the king said, okay, well, we got your answer. But because, first of all, the king wasn't happy that he chose the queen's answer, he should have said a goat, which is what the king said. But also because he waved his hand, he said, because you acted in a disrespectful manner, we're going to chop off your hand. And he told the official to chop off Yisachar, the Kohen Gadol's right hand. Well, the Yisachar was upset about this, so he bribed the official, and the official instead decided to chop off his left hand. When the king saw that he bribed the official, the king said, well, we're also going to chop off your right hand. So Yisachar lost both of his hands, and the Gemara says that Rav Yosef says that this was a kapara, so he wasn't punished in Olam Haba for the disrespectful way in which he acted. This is the story of Yisachar of Kfar Barkai, and because he gave the answer that the sheep was better than the goat. The Gemara says he was an Am Haaretz, that Yisachar was an Am Haaretz, because we know that from other sources that they're equal, that the sheep and the goat are equal before Hashem. And so Yisachar should have said that the sheep and the goat are equal, and if he had said that the sheep and the goat are equal, then he would have placated both the king and the queen, and he wouldn't have lost his hands. So that's the answer that the Gemara says he should have given based upon the pasuk. In the psukim in Vayikra it says iminat kvasim or iminat tzon. He could have said a sheep or a goat. This idea of having the option of taking a sheep or a goat as an offering before Hashem appears in our parasha, because even though for certain sacrifices you have to use a keves, a sheep, like for the carbon tamid, but we have this concept that there are other sacrifices where they're equal, and certainly one of those cases is the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering. That's the first sacrificial offering that the Bnei Yisrael are commanded to bring at all, the first one. It's a commandment to them while they're still in Egypt as a way of marking their upcoming redemption from slavery, but it's also an eternal commandment. And the Korban Pesach there are many unique aspects to it. It's the only Korban which everyone from Bnei Yisrael is required to eat from. It's failure to eat from this offering. If you say, I don't want to eat from the Korban Pesach, and you could eat from it, means that you're going to get the severe punishment of karet, of karet. So we see that this is one of the most unusual karbanot, and the Torah tells us specifically in our parasha about the commandment for Bnei Yisrael to bring a Korban Pesach. It's daber kol kahal adas Bnei Yisrael, and says if you want to take a mina from the sheep or from the goats, that we're told to take a seh, but the seh we're told explicitly in chapter 12 verse 5 could come from either the sheep or from the goats. Seh echad or abayis, but it could be a sheep or a goat. So there are many mitzvot associated with the Korban Pesach. In our parsha alone, the Sefer HaChinuch counts 9 separate mitzvot, and he doesn't even get into Pesach Sheni, which is only recorded in Bamidbar. But in our parsha alone, the Sefer HaChinuch lists 9 separate commandments associated with the Korban Pesach. And this is incredible and remarkable when you consider up until our portion, up until Parshas Bo, there are only 3 mitzvos in the entire Torah. So all of a sudden we have an explosion of mitzvos, and it's about the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is dominating. Like the beginning of the mitzvot is all about the Korban Pesach. And the Sefer HaChinuch and the other commentaries explain the symbolism behind many of the details of the Korban Pesach. Like, for example, the importance of it being roasted. Sefer HaChinuch says it shows that we're like kings, and the kings don't eat boiled food because that's a cheaper form, and the roasted is the nicer way. Chazkuni said we roast it so that the smell will go throughout the entire land. Everybody sees what we're having, the barbecue, celebrating our freedom, and we want to alert the Egyptians to our declarations of freedom. But the Sefer HaChinuch really sees within the intricacies of the laws a reflection on the fact that we are expressing our nobility, that we have redemption, and we're acting like kings on this night. And that's why he says, that's why there's a commandment not to break the bones of the Korban Pesach, the Chinuch says, because it's not honorable for the sons of kings and the advisors of the land to drag the bones and break them like dogs. Except for the poorest people and the starving, that's who does that. It's not proper for us to do this. We're like kings tonight. And therefore, as we began to become the chosen of all nations, the kingdom of priests and the holy nations, and each and every year at that time, it's fitting for us to do acts that show the great stature which we achieved at that hour above us. That's a Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Tes Zayin. So if that's the case, if there's a symbolism between every aspect of the Karban Pesach, the Sefer HaChinuch doesn't describe what's a symbolism of having the ability to choose a sheep or a goat. Why? What's the symbolism of that? So here I saw two explanations, and then I'll offer a third one, which I thought of also, with the help of Hashem. So one suggestion is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the Chumash based upon the works of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There, the commentary says that the Lubavitcher Rebbe teaches that there's a crucial difference between sheep and goats. And what's the crucial difference? Is that the goats are usually dark and the sheep are usually light. And so the Rebbe says the dark goat evokes the imagery of a life devoid of divine light. So the former life of a penitent sinner. So the goat represents the person who was sinning. And in contrast, the white, unassertive sheep evokes the imagery of a pure life where there was no sin at all, and undefiled by a skewed ego, meaning to say the life of a righteous person. And the fact that the Torah gives total equivalence to the sheep and or the goat, this teaches us, for the Karban Pesach, reflects the fact that all of the Bnei Israel are offering, this is a commandment upon all of the children of Israel, regardless of his or her spiritual status. It's not just like on Yom Kippur for the Kohen Gadol to bring it for everyone. This is for all of us to bring it. So writes the Rebbe, whether we are righteous or on the way to becoming righteous, we all have to internalize the message of the Exodus from Egypt and be redeemed from limitations that prevent us in progressing in our relationship with God. So therefore, to summarize, according to the Rebbe, the choice between a sheep and a goat represents the importance of including all Jews in this central offering. And this support for this approach of the Rebbe comes from many aspects of the law. It's supposed to be in a group. You have to be registered. People can be included in it. And it's a commandment on Kol Adas Yisrael, the entire community. And so just as when we were redeemed from Egypt, we were simultaneously reminded that through the Karban Pesach, the path of the redemption is open to both the sinner and the righteous. And furthermore, we're reminded that the ideal situation seems to be that the sinner and the righteous gather together to celebrate this annual celebration of redemption, and thereby encouraging the sinner to realize the possibilities inherent in a redeemed world. That's from the Rebbe. I saw another explanation from the Chidach, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, living in Jerusalem in the 18th century, and he takes it in another direction. He reflects upon the fact that there's a Gemara, that the Gemara says that Rav Zera saw Rav Yehuda in a happy mood. The Gemara in Shabbos, Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, he says he saw Rav Yehuda in a happy mood. He says, since he's in a happy mood, I'm going to ask him any question I want. He's going to be able to answer it. So he asked him a question. How come the goats, the Izim, walk at the front of the flock, and the sheep, in Aramaic, the Imri, walk in the back of the flock? So he asked that question. And Rav Yehuda, his answer was that since the goats, again, are dark, and darkness was in the world before there was light, so therefore the darker goats precede the lighter sheep. That's what Rav Yehuda said. So the Chida, in his brilliance, gives his own answer to Rav Zera's question. The Chida says the goats in Hebrew are called Izim. Izim comes from the word hard, oz, kasher, difficult, stubbornness. The Izim represents the Yetzer Hara. The Izim is also Azus Panim. It's another word for the Yetzer Hara. So Izim can mean goats. It can also mean stubborn. And so therefore it means it can relate to that concept. On the other hand, the word for sheep, Imri in Aramaic, can also be like Amar, to say in a soft tone. And it can also be another word for the Yetzer HaTov, for the good inclination. And so the word for sheep in Aramaic can mean a sheep, but it could also mean to say or speak in a positive manner. Says the Chida, the idea of the Izim always going before the Imri, the goats before the sheep, is this idea that that the Yetzer Hara precedes the Yetzer HaTov in this world, that the inclination to do good is to be trained and taught into us. So a person does not fully develop their Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer HaTov, only when they're older, when they become B'nai Mitzvah. And that's why it says the Chidah, the Izim typically come before the Imri. The goats come before the sheep. It says the Chidah, how does this relate to the Karban Pesach? It relates in the following manner. Because we need to maintain or to retain both aspects in our avodah of Hashem, in our service of Hashem. What does this mean? That the Izim, the Yetzer Hara, which was first, represents also a stubbornness and a strong desire to run, to do what it wants. The Yetzer Hara encourages us to run. Well, this idea of running, we have to bring into our service of Hashem. The way that the Yetzer Hara has the strength of rushing to a task, like if you have a Yetzer Hara for something, you rush to do it. Well, we have to bring that taiva and channel it into our service of God, and that's what the Chidah says is the point of bringing the Karban Pesach from the sheep and the goats is to tell us that we need both aspects in our service of Hashem. We need to use all of our personality traits in a positive manner and channel them in order to achieve a full redemption before Hashem. That's the explanation of the Chidah. I was thinking of a third approach. A third suggestion is that there's a marked contrast between the way Hashem tells us to take a sheep or a goat and between the earlier words of Paro. Because what does Paro say with respect to when Moshe Rabbeinu came to Paro, says, let our children go? Paro was upset at Bnei Israel, and what does Paro say? In the past I gave you sheep, but now in the past I gave you straw, but now kechulachem teven. Paro says to the Bnei Israel, take for yourselves straw. I'm not going to give you the straw. You have to go and get straw. Kechulachem teven. But the Torah, when the Torah speaks about the sheep or the goats, which is basically part of the chapter of the first mitzvah of Hashem, what does it say that Hashem gives us? It says Rosh Chodesh and Karban Pesach. What does it say? It says, Min hakvasim u'min ha'izim tikachu. Take from the sheep or from the goats. We have been commanded by Paro to take the straw. But Hashem tells us we have to take. We can take from the sheep or from the goats. So both scenes use the same action of kechu, of taking, but Paro gives them no choice. Paro says, kechu lachem min hateven, take from the kechu lachem teven, take the straw. That's what Paro tells us. The Bnei Israel have to take the straw, but the Torah gives our ancestors the ability to choose. Do you want a sheep or do you want a goat? It's a limited choice. It's almost frivolous, like the Kohen Gadol before the king and the queen. It's almost frivolous. What's the difference? It's a choice between a sheep or a goat, but it's still a choice. It's still a choice. And part and parcel of what it means to be free is to have the ability to choose and to recognize that our destiny is in our own hands. Part and parcel of what it means to be free is to have the ability to recognize that we have the ability to choose and that we have the ability to put our destiny into our own hands. Dr. Leon Kass notes that this commandment to observe the ritual of the Karban Pesach is unprecedented and not repeated in human history. He writes in his book, Reading Exodus, in a directive probably unmatched in human affairs either before or since. A fledgling people, a mere mass of oppressed slaves, are told even before it happens how to celebrate forever the event of their not yet deliverance. Even before it happens, they're told how to celebrate forever. The Israelites, the Bnei Israel, are standing on the precipice of redemption. Previously, our ancestors were not given a choice. Take the straw, kechulachem teven. But now they have a choice between a sheep and a goat. The difference may not be great. However, the fact that they have a choice is the point. As a redeemed nation and as a redeemed individual, we always have a choice in life. We can choose our destiny. We can choose the path that leads us back to Pharaoh, chas v'shalom, or you can choose the path that leads us to redemption.